The sun, a benevolent spotlight on the manicured lawn of 412 Juniper Way, had never seemed to favor Elara Vance's front yard so spectacularly. It illuminated the impossible, vibrant chaos of her cottage garden, a deliberate, joyful rebellion against the beige tyranny of arboreal crests. Her California poppies burned orange near the curb, defying the HOA-mandated 3-inch height limit. Clusters of deep purple salvia hummed with bees, and trailing sweet alyssum spilled over the edges of the mulch beds in fragrant, unapproved abandon. It was a defiant, beautiful mess, a small oasis of life in a neighborhood that preferred plastic perfection. Elara knelt by a cluster of newly bloomed geraniums, the soil cool and dark beneath her fingertips. This garden wasn't just landscaping. It was her shield. After a year of grueling deadlines and a particularly nasty divorce, the physical, honest labor of coaxing life from the earth had been her therapy. She felt a fierce, protective love for every petal and leaf. A shadow fell over her, but it wasn't the sun's. Elara. The voice was cool, starched, and instantly recognizable. It belonged to Carol Peterson, the self-appointed high priestess of the Arboreal Crests Architectural Review Committee, ARC. Carol stood on the pristine sidewalk, arms crossed over a crisp white linen blazer, looking less like a neighbor and more like a tax auditor. Elara sighed, standing up slowly, brushing the dirt from her worn gardening gloves. "Good morning, Carol. Having a nice stroll?" Carol's gaze swept over the garden, lingering on the poppies like they were biological hazards. "The ARC packet was delivered yesterday. You signed for it. I assume you've reviewed the documentation regarding the notice of violation?" Elara leaned against her spade. "The pink sheet with the Comic Sans font?" "Yes. It mentioned non-conforming aesthetic standards and unauthorized deviation from approved planting schedule 2.3b. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic nonsense." "Carol!" "It is not nonsense, Elara. It is the framework that maintains our property values," Carol stated, her voice tight with disapproval. "Your entire display is an affront to the established palette of native low-maintenance flora. Your garden is, to use the committee's official term, too busy." "Too busy? It's alive! I've replaced the dying, drought-stricken boxwoods the developer planted with water-wise, bee-friendly perennials," Elara countered, her emotional defenses hardening into steel. "My utility bills are lower than yours, I guarantee it. And you're complaining about the color? The color is irrelevant. The species are the issue. You are mandated to use plants from the approved list of hardy landscaping flora, Exhibit D. Your geraniums are not on it. Your poppies are not on it. Your entire front half-acre needs to be brought into conformity." Carol pulled a small, laminated card from her blazer pocket, as if about to administer a field sobriety test. "You have 7 days to rectify the violation, or a Level 1 fine will be levied, followed by mandated remediation by an ARC-approved contractor." The implied threat that strangers would come and rip out her work felt like a physical blow. "Mandated remediation? You'll destroy my garden over a salvia species you haven't memorized?" "It's in the rules, Elara. Rules protect us all. The aesthetic integrity of arboreal crests is not up for individual interpretation." Carol paused, offering a thin, condescending smile. "Perhaps you should stick to the community pool for your recreation." With that chillingly formal dismissal, Carol turned and marched back toward the uniformity of her own yard, a patch of perfectly green, utterly lifeless fescue. Elara didn't wait 7 days. She was not a crier, but the sight of the pink violation notice taped to her front door later that afternoon, a passive-aggressive upgrade from the morning's conversation, made her jaw ache. She marched inside, grabbing the hefty 3-ring binder that housed the HOA's governing documents, the Declaration of Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, CC&Rs. She needed to understand the enemy. For 3 hours, Elara sat at her dining table, the sun setting and casting long shadows across the sterile, rule-laden pages. It was a literary horror show, 22 pages dedicated solely to landscaping, soil, and hardscaping. There were rules on the acceptable angle of roof pitch, the approved shade of taupe for exterior paint, and the precise geometric shape of approved decorative rocks. She found the fine structure. Level 1, violation, 250 dawires. Level 2, repeat offense or non-compliance after 14 days, 500 gars, plus contractor fees. The threat was real. They would fine her into submission and then send a team of landscapers to obliterate her work and replace it with their dull, approved species. Ilara slammed the binder shut. Compliance meant defeat. It meant ripping out the life she had cultivated, replacing it with the same soulless, standardized greenery that choked the rest of the neighborhood. She pictured Carol Peterson driving by, savoring the victory of conformity. No. She stared out the window at her beautiful, doomed garden, then turned back to the binder, flipping to the section on permanent hardscape structures and arid landscape design, Section 412. The rules here were different. Hardscaping, defined as rock, metal, pre-approved structural wood, and non-living aggregate, was treated like an architectural element, not a garden. The rules governing permanent structures were far less prescriptive on aesthetics and far more focused on permanence, safety, and, crucially, low maintenance. 12C. Arid or xeriscaping installations utilizing non-organic ground cover, aggregate, crushed granite, permanent rock mulch, or decomposed rock are permitted, provided the installation includes structural elements to prevent erosion and contains an approved minimum of 80% non-irrigated, permanent hardscape coverage, non-irrigated, permanent, hardscape. A slow, terrible smile stretched across Ilara's face. If they wouldn't let her have a garden of life and color, she would give them a monument to defiance. She would give them the most permanent, low-maintenance, arid landscape installation the arboreal crests had ever seen. The rules permitted it. They mandated no aesthetic limits on the type of aggregate or the shape of the structural elements. She picked up her phone, the gardening gloves still on the table beside the CCNR binder. She didn't call a landscaper. She called the number for Titan Civil and Aggregates, a name she had once seen on a dusty construction yard sign miles away. "Hello? I need to speak to someone about a rush job," Ilara said, her voice calm, the emotional intensity of the past few hours channeled into a cold, precise determination. "I need to order about 20 tons of basalt boulders, a truckload of crushed limestone, and I need a quote on constructing a large perimeter, decorative wall, a structural retaining feature, if you will, around my entire front yard. I want it delivered and installed within the week." The decision was made. The poppies had to die, but their memory would be buried beneath a desert fortress of rock and stone, a perfectly compliant monument to HOA tyranny. Ilara Vance was complying with the letter of the law, and she was going to make Carol Peterson regret every single line of it. The morning air tasted like diesel and dread. Ilara stood on her porch, nursing a black coffee that tasted suspiciously like ash, watching the methodical destruction of her emotional fortress. The crew from Titan Civil and Aggregates, led by a laconic, barrel-chested foreman named Sal, were brutal professionals. They didn't sympathize. They executed. They had arrived before dawn, minimizing the initial neighbor spectacle, but the noise quickly grew into a defiant roar. The worst part was the scraping. Sal used a small skid steer loader, its bucket edge honed sharp to slice under the roots of the salvia, the geraniums, and the beloved California poppies. Ilara had tried to save a few, potting the hardiest specimens, but the majority of her lush, vibrant front yard was being systematically peeled back and loaded onto a large dump truck. The scent of crushed leaves and upturned, rich soil hung heavy, the smell of a dream dying. She watched a bee, confused, hover near where a cluster of purple blossoms had been only an hour before flying away empty-handed. Ilara felt a cold, empty spot open up in her chest, but she locked it down. This wasn't loss. This was strategy. She was sacrificing the pawn to capture the queen. By 9:30 a.m., her half-acre was a raw, red-brown expanse of exposed dirt, neatly outlined by a thin line of orange construction fencing. It was sterile, compliant, and infinitely worse than the colorful chaos it had replaced. Then the next phase of the delivery began, a massive flatbed truck, too large for the narrow, pristine streets of arboreal crests, groaned its way down Juniper Way. It was hauling the basalt, not decorative river rock, but jagged, brutal boulders, dark as charcoal and heavy with the history of volcanic violence. These were the rocks you saw reinforcing coastal breakwaters or guarding mountain highway cuts. They looked like they belonged in Mordor, not a master-planned community. The truck driver, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, had to perform a complicated, four-point turn to position the truck in front of Alara's house, drawing every set of curtains on the block. The sight of the monstrous, dark stones being offloaded with hydraulic precision sent a tremor of real panic through the quiet neighborhood. It was exactly at the moment the largest boulder, a thing the size of a smart car, roughly textured and utterly devoid of anything decorative, was hoisted by a small crane and lowered onto the property line that Carol Peterson appeared. She didn't march this time. She power-walked, her perfectly tailored navy suit seeming out of place against the dust and heavy machinery. She had clearly just returned from a board meeting or a brunch, her expression shifting from vague annoyance to white-hot horror as she took in the scene. Carol sidestepped a pile of excavated dirt and stopped dead at the orange fence line, her eyes wide as saucers. Sal, chewing on a toothpick, merely gave her a slow, neutral nod. "What in God's name is this, Alara?" Carol's voice was strained, barely audible over the crane's whine. She pointed a manicured finger at the basalt. "Is this a delivery? Is this artwork?" Alara walked down the steps, wiping the grime from her hands onto her jeans. She paused next to the largest boulder, running a hand over its rough, unyielding surface. "Good afternoon, Carol. No, this isn't art. This is compliance." Carol's eyes darted from the desolate yard to the colossal rock. "Compliance with what? The unapproved flora has been removed, certainly. But what is this? This enormous, unsightly granite? Basalt. And it's a permanent hardscape installation," Alara corrected, her voice low and steady. She felt a profound sense of cold calm, the emotional cost of the morning crystallizing into pure legalistic resolve. Specifically, it is a structural retaining feature to prevent erosion, constructed primarily of non-organic aggregate. We are utilizing a crushed limestone ground cover, also non-organic aggregate, which, as you can see, will cover well over the 80% minimum required by Section 412C of the CC&Rs. She looked directly into Carol's furious, bewildered eyes. "I am in strict compliance with the letter of your law. Carol, my front yard will be low maintenance. Non-irrigated and, as you requested, utterly lifeless," Carol sputtered, her perfect composure finally cracking. You cannot do this! This is a residential community. This looks like a medieval barricade. It violates the spirit of the community aesthetic. It violates. Good taste. Good taste is not a codified metric in your governing documents, Carol, Alara retorted, a cruel edge entering her tone. But the definition of structural retaining feature and non-organic aggregate most certainly is. If you wish to challenge the aesthetic quality, you will need to amend the CC&Rs to specify acceptable rock shape, size, and source. Until then, this is a legal permanent structure. Sal, sensing the end of the conversation, cranked the engine of his excavator, a deliberate earth-shaking rumble. He positioned the machine to begin arranging the smaller basalt pieces along the curb, the perimeter wall taking its first, brutal shape. These rocks weren't stacked neatly. They were interlocked, deliberately creating a rugged, impenetrable line. "You are doing this out of spite," Carol whispered, venom-coating the word. "I am doing this to maintain my property value and avoid escalating fines from the ARC," Alara replied, keeping her face perfectly blank. "I gave you a vibrant, drought-friendly garden. You demanded a desert. Now you have a fortress." The conflict wasn't just between two women anymore. It was between an individual's will and an unchecked system. Within the next hour, as the first run of the perimeter wall solidified, a 2-foot-high, jagged, charcoal-colored barrier, the neighborhood was in open revolt. People stood in groups at the end of their driveways, phones glued to their ears, their hushed, horrified whispers clearly audible. The wall was an instant, unavoidable blight on the street's uniformity. Later that evening, after the Titan crew had packed up, Ilara sat on her porch swing. Her yard was now a dystopian landscape of dark, imposing stone and bare, leveled dirt. It was silent except for the distant chirping of crickets. No more bees, no more wind chimes through the tall flowers. The Emergency Architectural Review Committee, ARC meeting, was held in the poorly lit, aggressively carpeted back room of the Arboreal Crests clubhouse. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and barely suppressed outrage. This was not a routine meeting. This was an inquisition. The long, collapsible table was lined with the three primary ARC members: Carol Peterson, the chairperson; Ted, a soft-spoken retiree who usually abstained from conflict; and Brenda, a real estate agent whose primary concern was commission checks and perceived property values. Behind the board, occupying the perimeter chairs, sat a dozen neighborhood residents, a visible, muttering jury of Ilara's peers. They glared at her, seeing not a neighbor but the seismic crack in the veneer of their community. Carol began, skipping all formalities. She didn't look at Ilara. She addressed the board with the righteous indignation of a prophet betrayed. "Gentlemen, Brenda, I refer you to the photographic evidence, Exhibits A through C, detailing the egregious, non-conforming architectural installation at 412 Juniper Way. This is not xeriscaping. This is the construction of a military bunker. A barricade! The size of the basalt aggregate, the sheer scale of the perimeter feature, it is an assault on the community aesthetic and, frankly, our collective property values." She then launched into the resolution. "I move to implement an emergency temporary injunction and immediate stop work order, effective immediately, pending a full aesthetic review by a third-party architectural firm. This construction must cease before the property becomes unsalvageable." Ted cleared his throat weakly. "Carol, I agree it's large. But Ilara did remove the unapproved flowers very quickly, and she cited Section 412C, which permits structural retaining features constructed of non-organic aggregate for arid landscapes. Is there a specific rule we can cite to stop the type of rock used?" Brenda nodded, crossing her legs, her realtor smile tight. "Yes, Carol. If we can't stop the what, we have to stop the how." Carol's eyes narrowed, flicking to Ilara for the first time. "The how is irrelevant. The structure is clearly not intended to retain soil. The ground is flat. It is a decorative fence, and fences over 1 foot require full ARC pre-approval, which Ilara never submitted. I move for the vote." "Excuse me," Ilara said, her voice cutting through the tension, clear and surprisingly calm. She hadn't prepared a passionate defense. She had prepared a legal strike. She held up her well-worn copy of the CC&Rs. "Before you vote on the stop work order, I need to remind the committee of the requirements for an emergency temporary injunction, as outlined in Article 9, Section 3B, Procedural Requirements for Expedited Action." The board exchanged uneasy glances. Carol's face tightened. "This is not a debate." "Ilara, this is a vote," Carol snapped. "On the contrary." "Chair Peterson, it is a procedural necessity," Ilara continued, her eyes never leaving the text. Section 3B states that for an emergency injunction to be valid, the board must demonstrate with written and dated evidence that the action being performed is a direct, irreversible threat to the common infrastructure, safety, or public access of arboreal crests. Furthermore, she emphasized, it requires a notarized engineering statement affirming the immediate danger. Failure to produce this evidence invalidates the emergency classification, requiring the action to be processed as a standard review with 14 days' notice. She laid the book flat on the table. "My property, 412 Juniper Way, is not on fire. The boulders are not blocking the street. They are anchored safely to my private property. I removed the flowers you hated and replaced them with a structure you permitted." "Where is the notarized engineering statement, Carol? Did you get an engineer to affirm that basalt rocks are an immediate, irreversible threat to the community?" A heavy silence descended. Carol's face was a mask of cold fury. She knew, and everyone in the room now realized, that she hadn't secured the mandatory legal prerequisite. She had relied on fear and procedural haste, assuming Alara would submit. Ted sighed, rubbing his temples. Carol, she's right. If we vote on this now, without the engineering report, any fine or injunction levied could be thrown out in arbitration, costing the HOA significantly. We have to follow our own rules. Brenda, the pragmatist, leaned forward. Carol, we have to table the emergency injunction. We can initiate a standard review, but we can't stop the work today. Not legally. The motion to pass the emergency stop work order failed, 2 votes to 1. Carol, defeated in public, rose from her chair, her linen blazer looking rumpled for the first time. She pointed a finger at Alara, her voice shaking with undisguised rage. You may win on a technicality, Alara. You may hide behind the most obtuse, poorly worded sections of the CCNRs, but this ends now. I will convene a full board review, and we will find every single loophole in this installation and bury you in fines until that monstrosity is gone. I look forward to it, Carol, Alara replied evenly. I'll be compliant. The next morning, the Titan crew returned, bringing not only the crushed aggregate, but also a renewed sense of purpose. Alara, having secured her procedural victory, felt the first flicker of genuine power since the conflict began. The perimeter wall, now dubbed the basalt barricade by whispering neighbors, was finished, a continuous, dark, jagged line separating Alara's property from the sidewalk. Sal and his crew then began the final crucial step, filling the interior. A gigantic skip loader backed onto the curb, releasing a massive pile of aggregate. It wasn't the pale, uniform crushed limestone Alara had initially discussed. It was, instead, a material she had sourced late at night after her meeting, using her procedural window. As Sal drove the skid steer back and forth, spreading the ground cover with practiced mechanical grace, the dust settled. The material was called black lava aggregate. It was a porous, lightweight volcanic rock, perfectly non-organic, perfectly low maintenance, and perfectly permitted by the CCNRs. But the key was the color. It was not gray, brown, or white. It was a deep, matte, obsidian black, making the front yard look like the surface of a distant volcanic moon. It absorbed the sun's light and heat, turning the once cheery front yard into an aesthetic black hole. The contrast with the surrounding green lawns and beige houses was so stark, so absolute, that it felt like a visual assault. By mid-afternoon, the transformation was complete. 412 Juniper Way was no longer a house in a suburban community. It was a defiant black fortress, a void of aesthetic nonconformity, yet, impossibly, completely legal. Alara watched from the porch as Carol Peterson drove by slowly, stopping her pristine sedan dead center in the street. Carol didn't get out this time. She just stared at the impenetrable basalt wall and the shimmering black expanse of the volcanic aggregate. A look of profound, career-ending failure etched onto her face. Then, from the driver's window, Carol raised her phone and snapped a single, furious photograph, a prelude to the war to come. She knew Alara hadn't just won a battle. She had permanently altered the landscape of their community. She had achieved perfect compliance, and it was the most hostile act of rebellion the HOA had ever faced. But Alara noticed something else. Embedded within the black lava aggregate, almost invisible at first glance, was a single tiny red flash of color. A lone surviving California poppy, its taproot somehow clinging to a pocket of soil deep beneath the rocks, had broken through the volcanic dust, blooming small and bright, a secret, defiant heart hidden within the fortress's compliance. The summer was merciless, but nowhere was it more aggressively felt than on Juniper Way. A heat wave, the kind meteorologists dubbed historic, settled over arboreal crests. The air shimmering above the taupe roofs was thick and heavy, but the air above 412 Juniper Way was a visible convection current. Alara's black lava aggregate, a material chosen for its density and, crucially, its compliance, was now an efficient thermal storage battery, turning the sun's energy into hostile, radiating heat. Carol Peterson, driving past in her climate-controlled sedan, found her steering wheel hot even after 2 minutes of exposure. Her perfectly green fescue, which edged up to the boundary of Alara's basalt barricade, was beginning to suffer heat stress. the blades closest to the dark rock turning sickly yellow. The complaints arrived at the HOA management office in a coordinated digital barrage. The neighbors, a group previously, divided between admiration for Ilara's gumption and horror at her aesthetic, were now united by the sheer discomfort. Mr. Henderson, at 410 Juniper, reported his air conditioning running constantly and a 10-degree temperature spike on the west side of his house. This was the opening Carol had been waiting for. 2 days after, the heat wave peaked. A certified, return receipt required letter arrived at Ilara's doorstep, delivered not by a postal carrier but by a stern-faced courier. It wasn't the usual pink sheet. It was a formal, multi-page legal brief from the HOA's external counsel. Violation of Environmental Hazard Code, Section 6.1a. The letter accused Ilara of creating an unmitigated heat island effect, which constituted an environmental hazard, damaging neighboring property and creating a non-conforming fire risk due to the aggregate's emissivity. The ARC, having learned its lesson, included a preliminary, if heavily biased, report from an architectural thermal consultant. The conclusion was damning. The black lava aggregate surface temperature exceeded the threshold for unreasonable and foreseeable risk to PVC pipes, organic materials, and public sidewalks. They demanded the immediate replacement of the black aggregate with a lighter, reflective material within 72 hours or face a fine of $1,000 per day, commencing immediately after the deadline. Ilara read the document twice, her apartment feeling suddenly cold despite the oppressive heat outside. They hadn't just found a loophole. They had weaponized the environment itself. This was no longer about flowers. This was about forcing her to tear down her defense by hitting her with an insurmountable financial penalty. She sat down with Sal, the foreman from Titan, on a couple of folding chairs in her garage, the only cool spot on the property. "They're calling it an oven," Ilara explained, pushing the documents toward him. "They say it's an environmental hazard. They want me to remove all the lava rock and replace it with white marble chips." Sal, ever practical, barely glanced at the paper. "They can call it a hot tub for ants, doesn't matter. We installed structural retaining features, right? That's what the basalt wall is for, retaining the aggregate fill." We complied with the letter. "The problem is the heat. Simple physics. So what's the compliance solution?" Ilara asked, dreading the answer. "Am I defeated? Do I have to shovel it all out?" Sal leaned forward, a conspiratorial glint in his eye. "You beat them on procedure, Ilara. Now you beat them on function. The only way they can regulate the temperature is if you're using unapproved materials. What if you make the aggregate functional again?" He sketched something quickly on a scrap of paper, a diagram of the basalt barricade. "They want the heat mitigated, right? And they want low maintenance? You need vertical structural elements, approved vertical elements. Something that can't be easily removed and is legally required for functional arid landscapes." Ilara stared at the sketch. An idea, cold and ruthless, formed in her mind, taking the tiny spark of the surviving poppy and turning it into a raging, controlled fire. The next day, the Titan crew returned, not with heavy machinery, but with crates of precast concrete blocks, approved, beige, square, and utterly boring. They also brought dozens of tiny, low-profile planting containers and bags of specialist, nutrient-poor, arid soil. Sal and his crew began installing the concrete blocks into the black aggregate. They weren't just decorative. They were being placed according to precise geometric patterns, creating a network of structural retention cubes, small, perfectly square, and compliant retaining features required for water-wise gardening per the original landscaping guide, a guide that predated Carol's aesthetic amendments. Then, Ilara went shopping. She returned with dozens of approved low-water, low-profile plants, specifically a variety of low-maintenance, perfectly gray-green succulents and cacti. No reds, no purples, no yellows. All color was leached out. She planted one tiny succulent in each concrete cube. She was bringing life back, but it was the most stoic, colorless, non-busy life possible. A perfectly compliant, geometric array of desert greenery. It was enough to reduce the exposed black aggregate and the associated heat zone, to a statistically compliant level. The showdown came 2 days later during a scheduled site visit by Carol Peterson and 2 members of the ARC. Carol was ready with thermal guns, cameras, and her lawyer's contact on speed dial. They approached 412 Juniper Way cautiously. The basalt barricade still stood, and the black aggregate still covered most of the yard. But now the obsidian surface was broken by the regimented, square grid of beige concrete blocks, each housing a tiny gray, spiky plant. It was an aesthetic compromise that was somehow more depressing than the pure blackness, a mathematical arrangement of compliance. "This changes nothing." "Ilara?" Carol declared, pointing the thermal gun at the nearest patch of black rock. "The bulk of the material is still creating a fire hazard and damaging the environment." "I disagree," Ilara said, stepping out, holding a copy of the old landscaping guide. "I have installed structural retention cubes per section 4.5b, mitigating the erosion risk, and planted approved water-wise flora. The cubes and plants now cover 20% of the surface, reducing the exposed aggregate below the threshold for environmental hazard, as per your own consultant's recommendations." Carol moved to argue, but the intense heat was making the air visibly waver. Ilara's fortress was working perfectly, and Carol was standing on the hot asphalt street right next to the border of the property where her own prize-winning lawn began. "This is not over. We will amend the rules on aggregate composition," Carol hissed, turning her focus to the property line. "And I have submitted a new violation for runoff. Your black rock is absorbing all the water and running it onto my property." "Runoff?" Ilara asked, a cold smile touching her lips. "I haven't watered this yard in a week, Carol. It's arid." Just as Carol turned to examine the fescue at the edge of her own property line, a sound ripped through the suffocating silence, a sharp, violent PFT! The source of the noise was Carol's side of the property line, precisely where her most aggressively watered strip of grass met Ilara's thermal hellscape. The immense unregulated heat radiating from the black lava aggregate over the last 3 days had done its work. The heat had critically stressed the shallow plastic PVC pipe connected to Carol's prize-winning, perfectly concealed pop-up sprinkler head. The pressurized pipe, softened by the oven-like surface temperature next to the basalt barricade, had ruptured. A geyser of water, brown and dirty from the underlying soil, erupted from the fescue, spraying wildly. It didn't just leak. It erupted, showering Carol Peterson, the impeccably dressed chairperson of the ARC, in a plume of filthy, pressurized water. The geyser soaked her tailored linen suit, plastered her hair to her face, and turned her white blazer instantly brown. The sight was so sudden, so total, that the 2 other ARC members froze in stunned silence. Carol stood there, dripping, gasping, her meticulously constructed facade shattered by the force of her own failing infrastructure, ironically destroyed by the passive, compliant heat of Ilara's fortress. Ilara didn't laugh. She just watched the water flood Carol's own lawn, the runoff Carol had just complained about. "It seems, Carol," Ilara said quietly, taking a step back toward the shade of her perfectly compliant porch, "that you have a drainage issue on your property.